Forest mysteries. The snow had a blue tint at this hour, the kind of blue that settled into the bones. Jared knew it well. 30 winters in the taiga taught a man to read the cold like a map. He shifted the rifle strap on his shoulder and checked his watch. 3 in the afternoon, but the sun was already a pale smear behind the firs. He had maybe 2 hours of proper light left. The tracks were fresh. Not poachers. He would have seen the snowmobile trails. A single pair of boots, maybe a hiker who strayed too far from the tourist routes. Stupid. Tourists always thought the forest was a postcard. Jared followed the prints to a clearing and stopped. The moose had been dead for days. Its carcass lay on its side, ribs exposed, meat stripped in long, clean strips. Wolf work, but the tracks around it were wrong. Too many wolves for a single kill, and the snow was churned up like something had fought. He knelt, touching the frozen ground. A smell hung in the air, sweet, like overripe fruit, but wrong. Rotten sweet. He'd smelled it before, once, when he found a deer carcass drained of blood with no tracks around it. That was 10 years ago. He told himself it was a freak thing. An animal sick with something. He stood too fast. The ice was hidden under the fresh powder, a slick skin over a buried root. His boot slipped. His weight came down wrong. A snap like a green branch breaking, but it was his ankle. The pain hit a second later, white and hot, climbing up his leg. He fell sideways, his shoulder hitting the snow, and for a moment he just lay there, breathing in short gasps. No, no, no. He pushed himself up on his elbows and looked at his foot. It was twisted outward, the boot already swelling against the laces. He tried to move it. The pain was so sharp his vision went gray at the edges. Broken. He knew the feeling. A bad fall from a tree stand 20 years ago. The same crack, the same useless limb. He dragged himself to the nearest pine, using his rifle as a crutch until the snow gave way and he fell again. The second time he crawled, the frozen ground biting through his pants. By the time he reached the trunk, sweat was freezing on his face. He leaned against the bark, breathing hard, and made himself think. 20 kilometers to the cabin. Maybe 22. No radio. He left it because the battery was weak and he was only going for the day. No food besides a chunk of bread and dried meat. A sleeping bag strapped to his pack. A lighter. A knife. He was a dead man. He said it aloud, just to hear it. Dead. The word hung in the cold air. No one heard. He took off his pack, hands shaking, and pulled out the first aid kit. There was no splint. He cut a branch from a nearby bush with his knife, then used the rifle stock as a second brace. He tore strips from his undershirt and wrapped the ankle tight. It took him an hour, working in the dying light, and by the end his fingers were numb and the pain was a constant, dull roar. He fired 3 shots into the air. The hunter's call for help. The sound was swallowed by the forest. No echo, just the wind. He pulled the sleeping bag around his shoulders and sat with his back to the pine. The twilight was seeping up from the ground, thick and gray. He thought about Larry back at the station, how the young man would notice he was gone maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. They'd come looking, but 20 kilometers in deep snow, in the dark, with no clear trail, they'd find him in spring. His mother used to say the taiga takes what it wants. She was a superstitious woman, always leaving bread for the forest spirits. He never believed. Now he looked up at the sky, a narrow strip of darkening blue between the branches, and he wanted to argue. He had no one to argue with. I did my work, he said. His voice was thin. I kept the poachers out. I left the kills for the wolves. I never took more than I needed. The sky said nothing. He closed his eyes. The cold was working its way through the sleeping bag, a slow, patient enemy. He thought of the cabin, the stove, the kettle that always whistled too loud. Small things. He thought of no one waiting for him, no one who would mourn longer than a week. That had always been a comfort. Now it just felt like a waste. He was almost asleep when the light changed. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. He forced his eyes open. 2 points of yellow, low to the ground. Not the green of a lynx. Not the red of a bear. Wolves. They were closer than he expected, 2 of them, shoulder to shoulder. He could see their breath in the fading light. His hand went for the rifle, but the rifle was under the snow 3 meters away, and even if he had it, he couldn't lift it. He watched them, waiting for the pain that would mean teeth. It didn't come. The wolves sat, then lay down, their eyes fixed on him. Not threatening. Waiting. The flashlight was in his pocket. He pulled it out, his fingers clumsy, and clicked it on. The beam swept over the snow and caught the eyes again. Amber gold, deep, ancient. They didn't blink. He let the flashlight fall. His hand was shaking too much to hold it. The dark came back, thicker now, and in the dark he heard the soft exhale of breath, the shift of bodies settling into the snow. They were close, so close he could almost feel the heat of them. He thought about the moose carcass, the way it had been stripped clean. He thought about the smell in the air, the sweetness that was not of the forest. He thought about the wolves waiting, and he understood, in a way that had nothing to do with reason, that they were not here for him. Not yet. He closed his eyes again, and the last thing he saw was the yellow glow behind his lids, patient and warm, like a hearth in the dark. Light woke him, not the gray twilight of the day before, but a pale yellow glow that meant morning. Jared opened his eyes and felt the weight against his back first, a solid, living pressure that rose and fell with slow breathing. Then the smell, fur, earth, the sharp musk of wild animals. He turned his head and saw the wolf's face inches from his own, its muzzle resting near his shoulder, eyes half closed. He did not move. His hand was numb, his leg a dull throb beneath the splint, but the rest of him was warm. Warmer than he had any right to be. The wolf's body curved along his spine, its ribcage expanding against his back. He could feel the heartbeat, steady and slow, and the heat pouring off the animal like a stove. The second wolf lay against his legs, curled into a tight ball, its head tucked under its tail. Both of them were pressed so close that the sleeping bag had become unnecessary. They had come in the night, while he was too weak to fight or flee, and they had shared their warmth. He knew this without understanding it. He lay still for a long time, watching the wolf's ear twitch at every sound. The forest was quiet, the way it was quiet after a snowfall. No wind, no birds, just the sound of 3 bodies breathing together. His grandmother used to tell stories about wolves, about how they were the forest's judgment and its mercy. He had always thought it was just talk, the kind of thing old women said to keep children close to the village. Now he was not so sure. The wolf against his back stirred. Its eyes opened fully, yellow and clear, and it looked at him. Not a challenge, not hunger, just a long, steady gaze that seemed to measure something in him. Jared held his breath. The wolf yawned, showing teeth the color of old bone, then settled its head back down and closed its eyes again. He let out the breath slowly. His leg hurt, a deep, grinding pain that pulsed with his heartbeat, but the cold had receded. He could feel his fingers again, though they tingled with the return of blood. He moved one hand, careful, and touched the fur of the wolf against his side. The hair was coarse on top, soft underneath. The animal did not react. This is not real, he thought. This is the fever. This is the cold taking my mind. But the warmth was real. The weight was real. He remembered stories from the old hunters, the ones who had been in the forest for 40, 50 years. They said wolves would come to a dying man sometimes, not to kill, but to wait, to keep the body warm until the end. He had never believed them. He had called it superstition, the same as his grandmother's prayers to the forest spirits. He closed his eyes and let the warmth soak into him. His thoughts wandered. He saw the cabin, the stove, the jars of pickled mushrooms on the shelf. He saw the woman who had left him 15 years ago, her face already fading in his memory. He saw his father's hands, rough from cutting wood, teaching him how to set a snare. All of it felt far away, like looking through the wrong end of a pair of binoculars. The wolf against his leg shifted. Jared opened his eyes and saw that the light had changed, the shadows longer. He had slept again. The animals were still with him, still pressed against his body, their warmth a shield against the deepening cold. He tried to lift his head and found it took more effort than it should. His mouth was dry, his lips cracked. He needed water. Before he could move, the wolf behind him lifted its head and let out a low sound. Not a growl, a warning. The other wolf was on its feet in an instant, ears flat, body low. Jared forced himself up on one elbow and looked out into the trees. The light was failing, the blue twilight returning. And in that twilight, something moved. He saw it only as a shape, darker than the shadows, larger than a man, moving between the pines with a strange, lurching gait. The wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in front of him, their hackles raised, and from their throats came a sound he had never heard before, a deep, rolling snarl that seemed to come from the ground itself. The thing in the tree stopped. For a moment, Jared saw 2 points of light, pale and unblinking, higher than a wolf's eyes, higher than a man's. They did not move. They did not blink. The smell came with them, that sweet, rotting smell from the clearing, and it was so thick in his throat that he almost choked. The wolves howled together, a single note that cut through the silence and echoed off the hills. The thing in the trees took a step back. A branch snapped under its weight, a sound like breaking bone. Then the light vanished, the smell faded, and the wolves fell silent. They turned back to Jared. The larger one, the one that had been behind him, lay down again, pressing against his side. The others circled once, twice, then settled against his legs. Their bodies trembled against him, muscles still tense, ears still pointed toward the dark. He did not close his eyes. He stared into the trees where the thing had been, and he waited for the dawn. The cabin felt wrong without Jared in it. Larry sat at the wooden table, his fingers wrapped around a tin mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, and listened to the wind press against the walls. The radio sat on the shelf across the room, silent since yesterday morning when Jared had said he was heading out to check the eastern boundary. No more than a day, he had said. The snow would hold. It was past noon now. Larry had been awake since 3 in the morning, when he heard the wind change and got up to stoke the stove. Sergei was already at the window, his broad back to the room, staring out at the gray light. He had not said much since Larry told him Jared had not come back. That was Sergei's way. The less he talked, the worse things were. "We go at first light," Sergei said now, his voice flat. He turned from the window and pulled on his coat, a heavy thing of worn leather that smelled of smoke and pine. "You stay? Keep the radio." "I'm coming," Larry said. Sergei looked at him. The old man's face was lined deep, the skin around his eyes the color of old snow. He had been in these woods since before Larry was born, had seen things that Larry had only heard stories about around village fires. "You know the Eastern Trail?" "I know it." "You know where he would go?" Larry hesitated. Jared did not always follow the marked trails. He had a way of wandering, of following some instinct that Larry had never learned. He was checking for poachers. The valley, maybe. Something flickered in Sergei's eyes, there and gone. The valley. It's closed season for sable. He said the outsiders might try. Sergei did not answer. He strapped on his snowshoes with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had done the same thing 1,000 times. Larry watched him, trying to read the silence. He had worked with Sergei for 3 years now, and still the man was a wall. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, something that looked like fear. They left the cabin as the sun cleared the ridge, the light so pale it seemed to drain color from the world. Larry carried the pack with the emergency kit, the extra rations, the flares. Sergei carried his rifle like a walking stick, the barrel pointed down, his eyes on the ground. They moved fast, faster than Larry would have thought possible for a man of Sergei's age, and by mid-morning they had reached the point where Jared's tracks left the main trail. Larry saw the blood first, a small smear on a branch, frozen dark, then another on the snow below. His stomach turned. He looked at Sergei, who had stopped and was studying the ground with an intensity that made Larry's skin prickle. "He fell," Sergei said. "There." He pointed to a spot where the snow was churned, a long scrape leading to a pine. "Broken something. Leg, maybe." Larry followed the trail. The marks in the snow told the story. Jared had crawled, dragged himself to the tree, used his rifle for support. He could see where the man had sat, the impression of his body pressed into the snow. He had been there for a while. The snow around was disturbed, but not by wind, by something else. "Wolves," Sergei said from behind him. Larry turned. Sergei was kneeling, his gloved hand hovering over a print in the snow. It was large, larger than any dog's, the claws leaving clear marks. And there were others, 2 sets, close together. They had come up to the tree and stayed. He could see where they had lain, their bodies pressed into the snow on either side of Jared's resting place. "They were here," Larry said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "They were with him." Sergei stood slowly. He looked out into the trees, his eyes narrowed, and Larry saw him reach for the rifle. Not raising it, just resting his hand on the stock. And something else. They followed the tracks. Jared's trail went north, toward the cabin, but the wolves had stayed with him. And around them, circling wide, was another set of tracks. Larry stopped when he saw them, his breath catching in his throat. They were not wolf tracks. They were too large for that, the stride too long, the weight too heavy. But they were not bear tracks either. Bears were in dens this time of year, and even if one had come out, the prints would show claws, a different shape. These looked almost human, but not quite. The toes were wrong, the arch too flat, the heel too broad. "What is it?" Larry whispered. Sergei did not answer. He walked along the circling track, his eyes on the ground, and Larry followed because he did not want to be alone in that clearing. The thing had circled the entire area, keeping its distance, moving from tree to tree. And then, where the wolves had lain with Jared, the tracks changed. The thing had come closer, had stood at the edge of the snow where the wolves had been, and then the snow was torn up like something had fought. Larry saw blood there, not much, frozen in dark drops. He saw fur, gray and black, caught on a branch. One of the wolves had been hurt, but there was no body, no sign of Jared being taken. The tracks of the thing led back into the trees, and the tracks of the wolves led north, following the path Jared had taken. "He's alive," Larry said. He wanted it to be true. He needed it to be true. Sergei looked at him, and for a moment Larry saw something in the old man's face that he had never seen before. Not fear. Something older. "The old stories," Sergei said, "the ones you think are just talk. Your grandmother told you about the forest." Larry nodded, not sure why. "There are things in these woods that do not follow the rules," Sergei said. He was looking at the trail ahead, where the trees grew close together and the light did not reach the ground. Your Jared found one, and something else found him first. They walked in silence after that, following the trail of wolves and the wounded man. The compass on Larry's wrist began to spin as they entered the deeper forest, the needle moving in lazy circles. He did not mention it. He was afraid of what Sergei would say. They found the place where Jared had been taken. The snow was trampled, the marks of men's boots and stretcher poles, the tracks of the search party that had come from the other side. And there, at the edge of the clearing, Sergei knelt again. His hand hovered over the snow, and Larry saw what he was looking at. Fresh tracks, massive, circling the site where Jared had been found. The thing had been here last night. Sergei stood and crossed himself, a quick gesture that looked like habit. He looked at Larry, and his face was the color of the snow. "We go back," he said. "We do not come this way again." Larry wanted to argue. He wanted to see the tracks himself, to measure them, to make sense of what he was seeing. But Sergei was already walking, his long strides eating up the ground, and Larry had to run to catch up. When he looked back over his shoulder, he thought he saw something move between the trees, something pale and watchful, but when he blinked it was gone. The compass needle was still spinning when they reached the cabin, and it did not stop until Sergei closed the door behind them. Time stopped meaning anything after the second day. Jared knew this because he counted the times the light changed, the slow shift from gray to blue to black and back again. But the numbers kept slipping away from him. He would hold 3 in his mind, then find himself thinking about something else, and when he reached for the number again, it was gone. The pain in his leg had changed too. It was no longer sharp. It was a deep, constant presence, like something living under his skin that fed on him while he slept. The wolves left when the sun was high. He watched them go, their bodies moving through the snow with a grace that seemed impossible for animals so large. The gray one, the one that had pressed against his back, stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked back. Its eyes were yellow, patient, and for a moment Jared thought it was waiting for something. Then it turned and vanished into the trees, and he was alone. The cold came back then, the real cold, the kind that worked its way into the spaces the wolves had filled. He pulled the sleeping bag tighter and tried to make his body small, to keep the heat in, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. His fingers were numb again, and his lips were cracked, and when he tried to swallow, there was nothing in his mouth but a dry, papery feeling. He thought about snow, not the snow around him, but the snow that fell in the village when he was a boy, the soft kind that came down in the evening and made the whole world quiet. His mother would make soup, cabbage, and a bit of meat if they had it, and his father would sit by the window and watch the flakes pile up on the sill. That was before the accident, before his father's hands stopped working right, before the quiet in their house became something that could not be filled with soup or snow. He did not know how long he sat there, thinking about things that had happened 30 years ago. The light changed again, and then the wolves were back. He did not hear them come. They were simply there, the gray one settling against his side, the black one curling at his feet. Their bodies were cold at first, colder than the air, and then they were warm, and then he could not tell where his body ended and theirs began. The gray one was watching him again. Jared lifted his hand, the movement taking all his strength, and touched the animal's shoulder. The fur was rough, matted in places, and beneath it he could feel the hard muscle, the steady pulse of blood. "Zima," he said. The word came out as a whisper, barely a sound. "I'll call you Zima." The wolf did not react. It kept its eyes on him, and Jared had the strange feeling that it was waiting for something more. A story, an explanation, something that would make sense of the man who lay broken in the snow with 2 wolves for company. "I didn't mean to end up here," he said. His throat was raw, each word a small pain. "I thought I knew these woods. 30 years, and I thought they knew me too." He laughed, a dry sound that turned into a cough. "Foolish. A man doesn't get to know the taiga. He just learns not to die in it for a while." Zima's ear twitched. The other wolf, the black one, had lifted its head and was looking out into the trees. Jared followed its gaze, but saw nothing. Only the dark, the endless rows of pines, the shadows pooling between them. "There was a woman once," he said. He did not know why he was talking. The words came out of him like water from a cracked cup. "She wanted to live here, with me. She said she loved the quiet. But the quiet is different in winter. It's not peace. It's the sound of everything waiting." He paused, trying to remember her face. He could not. He remembered her hands, small and brown, the way she held a teacup like it was something precious. She left when the snow melted. Said she couldn't breathe here. I told her I couldn't breathe anywhere else. The black wolf made a sound, a soft whine, and Jared realized it was not listening to him. Its ears were flat, its body tense, and Zima was rising too, his hackles lifting. The smell came before he saw anything, that sweet, rotten sweetness that clung to the back of his throat. He tried to turn, to see what was in the trees, but his body would not obey. The wolves stood between him and the dark, their snarls low and constant. He heard something move out there, something heavy, something that breathed in long, wet gasps. The wolves did not attack. They held their ground, and whatever was in the dark held its ground too, and the three of them waited in the silence while the cold crept back into Jared's bones. Then it was morning. He did not remember the night ending. One moment there was darkness and the smell and the sound of wolves snarling, and the next there was pale light and Zima's tongue on his face, rough and warm, cleaning the dried blood from his lips. The black wolf was gone. Zima stayed, her body pressed against his, and when she was finished she lay down with her head on his chest and watched him with those yellow eyes. He was hungry. He had not eaten since the bread the first day, and the hunger was a hollow ache beneath his ribs. He thought about the hare he had seen in the clearing before he fell, the way it had sat on its haunches and watched him pass. He thought about the moose carcass, the meat stripped clean, and his stomach turned. The black wolf returned at midday. She came out of the trees with something in her mouth, something dark and limp, and she dropped it on the snow beside him. A hare. The neck was broken, the body still warm. She sat back on her haunches and watched him, her tongue lolling, and Jared understood. He reached for the hare with hands that shook. His knife was still strapped to his belt, and he used it to slit the belly, the smell of blood and innards filling his nose. The meat was raw, the fur slippery in his fingers. He lifted a piece to his mouth and bit down, and the taste was copper and earth and life. He ate until his stomach cramped, and then he ate more, and when he was finished he lay back against the tree with blood on his face and looked at the wolves. They were watching him, both of them now, their heads tilted, and he knew that something had changed. He was not a man anymore, not the way he had been. He was something else, something that ate raw meat in the snow and slept with wolves and waited for the thing in the dark to come back. That night, Zima did not lie down. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her muzzle raised, and she howled. The sound went through Jared like a blade, pure and terrible, and when it faded he heard something answer. Not a wolf. Something that tried to sound like a wolf, that made the same shape with its voice but got the notes wrong, hollow and mocking, like wind through a dead tree. The black wolf pressed against him, trembling, and Jared put his hand on her back and held on. The thing in the dark was out there, waiting, but so were they. The search party had thinned by the third day. Two of the men from the village had gone back when the weather turned, saying there was no point looking for a dead man in a storm. Larry watched them go and did not argue. He understood. The forest was not kind to those who stayed out too long, and every man who walked these woods knew the difference between a search and a recovery. Sergei had said nothing. He simply loaded more supplies into his pack and waited by the door. They left at dawn, the snow falling in small, hard flakes that stung the face. Sergei led the way, his pace slower than before, his eyes never leaving the ground. Larry followed with the compass on his wrist, watching the needle hold steady for the first hour, then begin to drift. By mid-morning it was spinning in lazy circles, and Sergei had stopped looking at his own compass altogether. The forest changed as they went deeper. The pines grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead until the sky was only a memory. The snow underfoot was wrong too. It should have been soft this far from the wind, but it was hard, crusted over like something had walked here and pressed it down. Sergei stopped at the edge of a clearing and held up his hand. Larry saw it before he understood what he was looking at. The clearing was perfectly round, maybe 30 meters across, and there was no snow in it. Not a patch of bare ground. The earth was dark, dry, and the air above it shimmered like a summer road. In the middle of the circle lay a deer, its legs in the air, its throat torn open. There was no blood. The wound was clean, the flesh pale, and around the carcass there were no tracks. "Don't go in," Sergei said. His voice was low, tight. "Don't step on the bare ground." Larry stared at the deer. The eyes were open, frozen in a look that he did not want to name. "What killed it?" Sergei did not answer. He was looking at the trees on the far side of the clearing, his hand on his rifle. Larry followed his gaze and saw nothing at first, just the dark trunks, the shadows between them. Then one of the shadows moved. It was a small movement, a shift of weight, but it was enough. Something was standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. "We go around," Sergei said. He turned and began walking along the edge of the clearing, keeping the trees between himself and the open space. Larry followed, his legs unsteady, his eyes on the place where the shadow had been. It was gone now, or it was still there, waiting, and he could not tell the difference. The smell came to him as they walked. Sweet, thick, like flowers in a closed room. He had smelled it once before, when he was a boy, at his grandmother's funeral. The incense, the candles, the heavy sweetness of death. He tried not to breathe through his nose, but the smell was in his mouth, on his skin, and he could not escape it. They walked for another hour, maybe two. Larry's legs ached, and the pack was a weight on his shoulders, and the compass on his wrist still spun, meaningless. Sergei moved like a machine, his eyes always on the ground, his steps measured. Larry wanted to ask where they were going, how he knew the way when the compass was dead, but he was afraid of the answer. They found the tracks in a narrow gully where the snow was deep and the wind had not touched it. Boot prints, fresh, leading north. And beside them, the prints of wolves, two sets, moving with the man. Sergei knelt and touched one of the boot prints, then looked up at Larry. There was something in his face that Larry had never seen before. Not hope, recognition. "He's alive," Sergei said. "He's walking." Larry wanted to believe it. He looked at the tracks, tried to measure the stride, the depth of the prints. They were uneven, one deeper than the other, a man dragging a leg. A man who should have been dead 3 days ago. How? Sergei stood and looked up at the sky, or where the sky should have been. The branches were so thick overhead that Larry could not tell if it was day or night anymore. He had help. They followed the trail into a part of the forest that Larry did not recognize. The trees here were older, their trunks wider than a man's reach, their bark black with age. The silence was complete. No wind, no birds, no sound of his own breathing. He stopped to check his compass and found the needle frozen, pointing not north, but somewhere to his left, toward a place where the trees grew even closer together. "Sergei," he said. The old man was already looking. There was a space between two pines, a gap that should have been filled with shadow, and beyond it Larry could see something that did not belong. A light, pale and steady, like a lamp in a window. But there were no cabins here, no trails, no reason for light in the middle of the forest. "That's where he went," Sergei said. He was not looking at the light. He was looking at the tracks on the ground, the boot prints and the wolf prints, all of them leading toward the gap between the trees. "And that's where the other one is waiting." Larry raised his rifle. The movement felt slow, like moving through water. The light between the trees flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw a shape in it, tall and thin, with arms that were too long and a head that did not sit right on its shoulders. He tried to focus on it, to make sense of what he was seeing, but his eyes would not cooperate. Every time he looked directly at it, it was just light, just shadow, just the space between the trees. "We go in," Sergei said. "We get him, and we go out. We do not look at anything except the ground and the man. You understand?" Larry nodded. His mouth was dry, his hands shaking on the rifle. Sergei took a step toward the gap, and Larry followed, and the light between the trees grew brighter, and the smell of flowers grew stronger, and the compass on his wrist began to spin again, faster now, until the needle was a blur. They found Jared at the base of a pine, his face gray, his eyes closed, his leg wrapped in a splint that looked like it had been made by a dead man. The wolves were with him, one on each side, their bodies pressed against his. They looked up when Sergey and Larry came close, and for a moment Larry thought they would attack. Their eyes were yellow, flat, the eyes of animals that did not recognize mercy. Sergey stopped. He looked at the wolves, and the wolves looked at him, and something passed between them that Larry did not understand. Then the gray one stood, stretched, and walked into the trees. The black one followed, but at the edge of the clearing it stopped and looked back at Jared, and Larry could have sworn it nodded. Then it was gone. They lifted Jared onto the stretcher. He was light, too light, his bones sharp under his clothes. His eyes opened once, looked at Larry without seeing him, and closed again. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Sergey covered him with a blanket and took one end of the stretcher, and Larry took the other, and they began the walk back. The light between the trees was gone when they passed it. Just shadow, just the space between two pines. But the smell lingered, sweet and thick, and Larry did not breathe again until they were out of the gully and the compass on his wrist had stopped spinning and pointed, at last, toward home. The cabin smelled of iodine and boiled potatoes when Jared opened his eyes. The ceiling was the same one he had looked at for 30 winters, the same dark beams, the same crack in the corner where the roof had settled wrong. But the weight against his chest was gone. The warmth was gone. He lay in the narrow bed by the stove and listened to the silence. And for a long time he did not move. Larry found him staring at the window. The younger man had a bowl of broth in his hands, steam rising from it, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw Jared's face. "You're awake," he said. His voice was careful, the way people spoke when they were not sure what they were dealing with. "How long?" Jared's throat was raw, the words scraping out of him. 5 days. The doctor came from the village. Said your leg will heal, but you need to stay off it. Larry set the bowl on the table and pulled out a chair. He did not sit. He stood with his hands on the back of the chair, his knuckles white. "We thought you were dead. Sergey and I. We went looking, and we found the tracks, and then the clearing with the deer, and then—" "I know," Jared said. He did not want to hear it. The memory was still there, behind his eyes, waiting. The smell of the thing in the dark. The sound of Zima's howl. The taste of raw hair on his tongue. He pushed himself up on his elbows and looked around the cabin. Everything was where it should be. The stove, the table, the rifle leaning in the corner. But it all looked different now. Smaller. Colder. "The wolves," Larry said. He sat down finally, his hands in his lap. "They were with you. When we found you, they were lying on either side of you. Sergey said they kept you warm. Kept something else away too, I think." He looked at Jared, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. Fear, maybe, or the beginning of it. Jared did not answer. He picked up the bowl of broth and drank it, the warmth spreading through his chest, and he thought about what Larry was not saying. The thing in the forest. The thing that had circled them, that had answered Zima's howl with a voice that was almost a howl. He had thought it was a fever dream, the cold playing tricks on his mind. But Larry had seen something too. The clearing with the deer. The tracks that were not wolf tracks. Sergey went back to the village, Larry said. He said he had things to do. He did not say when he would come back. He paused. He said something else too. Before he left, he said you should not go into the forest again. Not that part of it. He said the old ones do not forget. Jared set the bowl down. His hand was steady. That surprised him. Everything else about him felt unsteady, like the ground under his feet had shifted and he had not found his balance yet. But his hand was still. "The old ones," he said. What did he mean by that? Larry shrugged, but it was a small movement, tight. Stories. The kind my grandmother used to tell. About the things that lived in the forest before we came. The things that do not follow the rules. He looked at the window, at the dark square of glass that showed nothing but the night. I used to laugh at those stories. And now I do not laugh. They sat in silence for a while. The stove ticked as it cooled, the metal contracting. Jared watched the shadows move across the ceiling and thought about the warmth of the wolves, the way their bodies had pressed against his, the way they had given him something he had not asked for. A second chance. A debt. "The gray one," he said. She brought me a hair, dropped it at my chest. I ate it raw. Larry did not say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, as if he was afraid of being heard. "That is not something a man does." "I was not a man then," Jared said. "I was something else, something that was dying, and she kept me from dying." He looked at Larry, and for the first time he saw the younger man clearly. The fear in his eyes, yes, but something else too. Something that looked like understanding. "You saw something out there. In the forest. Tell me." Larry's hands tightened on the chair. "I do not know what I saw. A light between the trees. A shape. It was watching us. And the compass would not work. Sergei's either. It just spun the whole time we were in the valley. It did not stop until we came back here." He stood up, suddenly restless, and walked to the window. "What was it, Jared? What was out there with you?" Jared thought about the smell, the sweet smell that was not of the forest. He thought about the eyes he had seen in the dark, pale and unblinking, higher than a man's eyes. He thought about Zima and the other wolf, how they had stood between him and the thing, how they had snarled and held their ground. "I do not know," he said, and it was almost true. He did not have a name for it, but he knew what it wanted. It had wanted him, and the wolves had not let it take him. Larry turned from the window. "There is something else. When we brought you back, when we were putting you in the bed, your lips were moving. You were saying something over and over. I could not understand all of it, but I heard one word. Zima. You kept saying Zima." Jared closed his eyes. The name was there, in his mind, the sound of it. He had given it to her in the snow, in the place between sleeping and waking, and she had accepted it. He did not know how he knew that, but he did. "It means winter," he said. "The gray one. I called her Zima." Larry nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he did not. He picked up the empty bowl and carried it to the sink, and Jared watched him move around the cabin with a new awareness. The young man was afraid, and the fear was not going to leave him. It would sit in his chest now, the way it sat in Jared's chest, a small cold thing that would not warm. That night, when Larry had gone to his own room and the cabin was dark, Jared sat up in bed and looked out the window. The snow was falling, soft and silent, the flakes catching the light from the stove. And at the edge of the tree-line, where the forest began, he saw two shadows. They were sitting side by side, watching the cabin, and he knew they were waiting for something. He reached for the piece of dried meat on the table beside his bed. He had saved it from his supper, had set it aside without thinking, as if he had known he would need it. He opened the window, just a crack, and set the meat on the sill. The cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, and he closed the window and went back to bed. In the morning, the meat was gone. There were prints in the snow below the window, 2 sets, leading back into the trees. Larry saw them when he came out to get wood, and he stood there for a long time, looking at them. He did not say anything when he came back inside. He did not need to. The track said enough. The snow was beginning to soften when the word came from the village. Jared sat on the cabin steps, his legs stretched out in front of him, the crutches beside him, and watched the icicles drip. 3 weeks since they had carried him out of the forest. 3 weeks of sitting, of waiting, of watching the tree lean for shadows that did not come. His leg was healing, the doctor said, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. That was fine. He had made peace with it. Larry came up the path with a letter in his hand, his face tight. He did not say anything at first. He stood beside the cabin and looked out at the trees, the way Sergei used to look, and Jared felt something cold settle in his chest. "Poachers," Larry said finally. 3 of them. They went into the valley 2 days ago. The old valley, where we found you." He handed the letter to Jared. "The villagers saw them going in. They tried to warn them, but the men laughed, said they did not believe in old stories." Jared read the letter. It was from the head of the village council, a man named Pavel who had never liked Jared but respected him. The poachers were outsiders, city men looking for sable pelts. They had gone in with rifles and snowmobiles and enough supplies for a week. They had not come out. The villagers had heard shots the first night, then nothing. No one wanted to go in after them. "They want us to find them," Jared said. Pavel asked. "He said you know that part of the forest better than anyone." Larry hesitated. "I told him you were still healing. I told him maybe we should wait." Jared looked at the letter again, then at the tree line. The sun was low, the shadows long, and in the distance he could see the dark line of the forest where the valley began. He thought about the thing in the dark, the way it had watched him, the way the wolves had stood between them. He thought about the men who had gone in there, laughing at the old stories, with their rifles and their machines and their certainty that the world was only what they could see. "We go tomorrow," he said. Larry opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He had learned, in the weeks since the rescue, that there were some things Jared would not be talked out of. He nodded and went inside to pack the gear, and Jared sat on the steps and watched the light fade. The valley looked different in the spring. The snow was patchy, the ground showing through in brown streaks, and the air had a damp smell that was almost sweet. Jared moved slowly, his crutches sinking into the soft ground, Larry beside him with the rifle. They had left the snowmobiles at the edge of the forest, knowing the noise would give them away, and walked the last 2 kilometers in silence. The tracks were easy to follow. 3 men, 2 snowmobiles. The machines left at the edge of a clearing where the trees were too thick to ride through. Jared knelt beside one of the snowmobiles and touched the engine. Cold. They had been here for at least a day. He looked at the tracks leading into the trees and felt the old dread rising in his chest. "Stay close," he said. "Do not look at anything except the ground." Larry nodded. His face was pale, but his hands were steady on the rifle. They followed the tracks into the trees, and the light changed, the pines closing in overhead, the shadows deepening. Jared's leg ached with every step, but he did not stop. He could smell it now, the sweetness in the air, faint but there. The same smell from the night under the pine. They found the camp at the bottom of a gully. The tent was torn, the fabric hanging in strips, and the gear was scattered across the ground. Sleeping bags, cooking pots, a camera with a broken lens. And blood. Not much, but enough. Jared stood at the edge of the camp and looked at the trees, at the shadows that seemed to move when he was not looking at them. "There," Larry said. His voice was barely a whisper. One of the men was sitting against a tree at the far end of the gully. His head was down, his hands in his lap, and he was rocking back and forth, a slow, steady motion that did not stop when they approached. His clothes were torn, his face scratched, and his hair had turned white at the temples, white as winter snow. Jared knelt beside him. The man's lips were moving, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice so thin it was almost air, he began to speak. It wore his face. It came out of the trees, and it wore his face. Larry. It was Larry, but it was not Larry. The eyes were wrong. The eyes were wrong. Larry made a sound behind Jared, a small choked noise. Jared did not turn. He took the man by the shoulders and tried to lift him, but the man would not move. His hands were frozen around something in his lap. A rifle, the barrel bent, the stock splintered. He had fired it until it broke, and whatever he had been firing at was still out there. "We need to go," Larry said. His voice was shaking. "Jared, we need to go now." Jared looked up at the trees. The shadows were deeper now, the light failing, and he knew they had stayed too long. He pulled the man to his feet, half carrying him, half dragging him, and Larry took the other side. They moved up the gully, away from the camp, and the smell followed them, sweet and thick. At the edge of the clearing, Jared stopped. The snow was churned up here, the tracks of 3 men running, and among them, other tracks. Wolf tracks. A pack of them, circling the camp, moving between the trees. And there, In the soft mud where the snow had melted, a track that was not a wolf and not a man. It was large, larger than his hand, and the toes were wrong. Too long, too narrow, too many. He looked at Larry, and Larry was looking at the same track, his face the color of the snow. Neither of them spoke. They took the man and walked back through the forest, and Jared did not look behind him. He knew what was there. He had known since the first night under the pine. When they reached the edge of the forest, the compass on Larry's wrist began to spin. Jared looked back at the trees, at the dark between the trunks, and for a moment he thought he saw something watching. Two pale eyes, high off the ground, unblinking. Then the wind shifted, the clouds covered the sun, and it was gone. The poacher sat in the corner of the cabin, his knees drawn to his chest, his white hair sticking up in tufts where he had been pulling at it. Larry had put a blanket over his shoulders, but he was still shaking, a fine tremor that never stopped. He had not spoken since they brought him back. His eyes moved around the room, always moving, never resting on anything for more than a second. When they did stop, they stopped on the window, on the dark glass, and then the shaking got worse. Jared sat at the table, his legs stretched out, and watched the man. He had seen fear before, the kind of fear that comes from being lost in the woods or caught in a storm. He had seen men cry for their mothers, and men who went silent and never spoke again. But this was different. This was fear that had eaten something inside the man, something that was not coming back. "We need to call the authorities," Larry said. He was standing by the stove, his hands wrapped around a mug, not drinking. "There are 2 more men out there. Dead, probably. We need to tell someone." Jared nodded. The radio was on the shelf, charged now, waiting. One call would bring the police, the Forest Service, men in uniforms who would ask questions. They would want to go into the valley, to find the bodies, to make sense of what had happened. They would go in with their equipment and their certainty, and some of them would not come back. He knew this the way he knew the weather was changing, a pressure in his bones. "Tomorrow," he said. "We call tomorrow." Larry looked at him, and there was something in his face that had not been there before. Not fear. Judgment. "You want to wait. You want to see what happens." "I want to think." The poacher made a sound then, a small whimper like a dog that had been kicked. His eyes were on the window again, and the shaking had become a shudder, his whole body jerking. "It's out there," he said. His voice was high, thin. "It followed us. It knows where we are." Larry went to him, knelt beside him, tried to put a hand on his shoulder. The man flinched away, pressed himself deeper into the corner. "No one followed us. We're safe here." "You don't understand." The poacher's eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, the whites showing all around. It wore his face. It came out of the trees, and it was him. It was Sergei, but the eyes were wrong. "I saw them. Yellow. They were yellow." Jared's hand tightened on the table. Sergei had left for the village 3 days ago. He had said he would be back in a week. There was no reason for him to be in the valley, no reason for him to be anywhere near the poacher's camp. But the man was not lying. The fear in his voice was too real for lies. "Get some sleep," Jared said. He did not know which of them he was talking to. Larry looked at him, then at the poacher, then nodded and went to the other room. The cabin was quiet after that. The only sound the ticking of the stove and the man's breathing, fast and shallow. Jared did not sleep. He sat at the table and watched the window, the square of darkness that was the night outside. The moon was up, half full, and he could see the tree lean, the dark line of pines against the gray sky. He thought about the thing in the forest, the thing that had circled him while the wolves held it back. He thought about the deer in the clearing, drained of blood, and the tracks that were not wolf tracks. He thought about Sergei's face when they found the tracks, the way the old man had crossed himself. He was still sitting there when the sound came. A door opening, soft footsteps, the creak of the cabin door. He was on his feet before he knew he was moving, his legs screaming, his hand on the rifle. The door was open, a crack of moonlight, and the poacher was gone. Larry came out of his room, his eyes wide. "What happened?" Jared did not answer. He grabbed his coat, his crutches, and moved to the door. The snow outside was soft, the ground muddy where it had melted, and the tracks were easy to follow. The poacher had run, his bare feet leaving deep impressions in the wet ground, heading straight for the treeline. "Stay here," Jared said. "No," Larry was beside him, his rifle in his hands, his face set. "We go together." They followed the tracks into the forest. The moon gave enough light to see, the shadows long and black, the trees standing like sentinels. Jared moved as fast as he could, the crutches sinking into the soft ground, the pain in his leg a constant fire. Larry was ahead of him, following the trail, his rifle up. They found the poacher at the edge of the valley. He was on his knees, facing the trees, his hands in the snow. He was not moving. Larry stopped, raised his rifle, and then lowered it. "Jared." The wolves were there, Zima and the black one, standing between the poacher and the valley, their bodies blocking the path. They were not growling. They were simply standing, waiting, and the poacher could not go past them. Every time he tried to move, they shifted, blocking him, hurting him back. Jared came up beside Larry and looked at the wolves. Zima's eyes found his, yellow and steady, and for a moment he understood. They were not going to hurt the man. They were not going to let him go into the valley either. The thing in the forest had marked him, the way it had marked Jared, and the wolves were the line between. "What do we do?" Larry's voice was barely a whisper. Jared looked at the poacher, at the white hair, the trembling hands, the eyes that saw something neither of them could see. He looked at the wolves, at Zima, at the memory of her body against his in the cold. He looked at the valley, dark and waiting, and he felt the pull of it, the same pull he had felt when he lay dying under the pine. He could let the man go. He could let the forest take what it had claimed. It would be easy. The poacher had broken the law, had come here to kill what should not be killed, and the forest had its own justice. He could turn around, go back to the cabin, and in the morning he could say the man had run and he could not find him. He stepped forward. The wolves watched him, their heads turning, their ears flattening. He took another step, and then he was beside the poacher, his hand on the man's shoulder. The man looked up at him, and his eyes were clear for the first time since they had found him. "I can't go back," the man said. "It's in me now. It's always with me." Jared pulled him to his feet. The man was light, lighter than he should have been, his bones sharp under his clothes. "You're going back. You're going to tell them what happened, and you're going to live with it." He turned the man around and pushed him toward Larry. The wolves did not move. They stood at the edge of the valley, watching, and Jared walked toward them. Zima was close enough to touch. He stopped in front of her and looked into her eyes, and he saw something there that he had not seen before. Not judgment, not welcome, recognition. "He's mine," Jared said. "He goes back." Zima held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned and walked into the trees. The black wolf followed, and the two of them vanished into the shadows. The valley was dark behind them, the path open, but nothing came out of it. The pull was gone. The choice was made. Larry was waiting with the poacher, his face pale in the moonlight. "Is it over?" Jared looked at the valley, at the place where the wolves had disappeared. "No," he said, "but it's done for tonight." He took the poacher's other arm, and the three of them walked back through the forest, toward the cabin, toward the light in the window. He did not look back. He did not need to. He knew the wolves were watching, and he knew the thing in the valley was waiting. But for now, he had chosen. And for now, that was enough. The thing came for them before dawn. Jared felt it first as a pressure change, the way the air thickens before a storm. He was walking at the rear, the poacher stumbling ahead with Larry, and the silence that had followed them from the valley was suddenly not silence anymore. It was a weight, a presence, and when he stopped to listen, the forest stopped with him. No wind, no birds, just the sound of three men breathing, and something else breathing too. Larry turned, his face gray in the moonlight. "Do you feel that?" Jared did not answer. He was looking at the trees behind them, at the shadows between the trunks. The path they had followed from the valley was gone. Not covered, not hard to find. Gone. The trees had shifted, the ground had changed, and what had been a clear route back to the cabin was now a wall of pine and shadow. He had walked these woods for 30 years, and he had never been lost. Now he did not know which way was home. "Keep moving," he said. "Do not stop." They walked. The ground was soft underfoot, the snow giving way to mud, and the trees pressed closer with every step. Jared's leg was a constant pain, the crutches sinking into the earth, and he could feel the thing behind them, the weight of it, the attention. It was not hunting. It was hurting them, pushing them back toward the valley, and he did not know how to stop it. The poacher stopped first. He stood in the middle of the path, his arms hanging at his sides, his head tilted like he was listening to something. "It's here," he said. His voice was calm now, the fear gone. "It wants to talk." Larry grabbed his arm, tried to pull him forward, but the man would not move. He stood there, swaying slightly, and then he pointed into the trees. "There. Look." Jared looked. At first he saw nothing, just the dark trunks, the spaces between them. Then one of the spaces moved. It stepped out from behind a pine, and it was tall, taller than a man, and it was shaped like a man but wrong. The arms were too long, the shoulders too high, and the face. The face was something he had seen before, in a fever dream under a pine, in the dark of the valley. It was his own face, but older, the skin stretched tight over the bones, the eyes yellow and flat. Larry raised his rifle. The thing did not move. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them, and the smell came with it, that sweet, rotting smell that filled Jared's throat and made his eyes water. "Don't," Jared said. He did not know why he said it. Every instinct told him to shoot, to run, to do anything except stand there. But his hand was on Larry's rifle, pushing it down, and his feet were rooted to the ground. The thing opened its mouth. The sound that came out was not a voice. It was the forest, the wind through dead leaves, the creak of branches, the crack of ice. And beneath it, words, or something like words, shaped by a throat that had never learned to speak. "You took what was mine." Jared understood. He understood the deer in the clearing, drained of blood. He understood the tracks that circled the camp, the thing that had waited in the dark while the wolves held it back. He understood why the poacher's hair had turned white, why his eyes saw things that were not there. The forest had a keeper, something old and patient, and it did not forgive. "He's a man," Jared said. His voice was steady, though his hands were shaking. "He made a mistake. He'll leave. He won't come back." The thing stepped closer. The face was his face, but the eyes were not his eyes, and the mouth was stretched into something that was almost a smile. "You made a choice. Now you live with it." The trees behind them groaned. Jared turned and saw the path closing, the branches interlocking, the shadows deepening. The thing was going to take them, all three of them, and there was nothing he could do. He had made his choice, and the forest was going to make its own. The sound came from behind him. A howl, high and clear, splitting the silence like a blade. Zima stepped out of the trees, her hackles raised, her teeth bared. The black wolf was beside her, and behind them, more shadows moving in the dark. The pack had come. 6 of them. 8. He could not count, their eyes yellow in the moonlight, their bodies low and ready. They formed a ring around the 3 men, facing outward, facing the thing. Zima stood at the front, her muzzle raised, and she looked at Jared with eyes that held no fear. She had made her choice too, a long time ago, under a pine in the snow. The thing took a step back. Its face was his face, but the expression was something else. Anger, yes, but something older too. Something that had been in this forest since before men walked upright, and something that was, for the first time, uncertain. "You would fight me for them?" Zima did not answer. She did not need to. She stood her ground, and the pack stood with her, and the thing in the trees watched them with eyes that burned. The ground shook. The trees trembled, their branches rattling, and the thing opened its mouth and made a sound that was not a howl and not a roar, something in between, something that Jared felt in his chest more than heard. The wolves answered, every one of them, their voices rising together, a wall of sound that pushed back against the dark. Jared grabbed Larry's arm, grabbed the poacher, and pulled them forward. The wolves moved with them, the pack closing around them like a shield. The thing tried to follow, but the wolves turned, snarling, and it stopped. It stood at the edge of the trees, watching, and the smell of it was thick in the air, but it did not come closer. They walked for an hour, maybe two. Jared did not know. The wolves stayed with them, Zima at the front, the black wolf at the rear, the others moving through the trees on either side. The path opened before them, the trees pulling back, and slowly the light began to change. The gray of dawn, thin and cold, creeping over the horizon. At the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to the open ground around the cabin, Zima stopped. She looked at Jared, and he saw something in her eyes that he had not seen before. Not a farewell, a promise. Then she turned and walked back into the trees, and the pack went with her, one by one, until there was nothing left but tracks in the snow. Larry was leaning against a tree, his face streaked with tears. He did not seem to know he was crying. The poacher stood beside him, silent, his eyes empty. Jared looked back at the forest, at the dark line of pines against the gray sky, and he knew the thing was still there. It would always be there, but the wolves would be there too. Let's go home, he said. They walked the last 100 meters to the cabin in silence. The sun was rising, the light thin and pale, and when Jared opened the door and stepped inside, he felt the warmth of the stove on his face. He stood there for a moment, breathing, and then he closed the door behind him.